make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Do you remember the Ten Commandments are put there in the Ark of the Covenant, put there in the Holy of Holies? Well, we know that's exactly what they did with these covenant tablets. And what that, like for example, the Vassal Treaty of Esarhaddon, which is a text that we have, one of these ancient treaties that would probably installed in Israel, the northern kingdom, in 1st century BCE. And that was Esarhaddon saying, I own this place. And there seems to me to almost be a mapping on what's happening right now with the Ten Commandments installed, in inverted commas, in school classrooms. It's really Christians saying, we own this place. You know, it's just, the symbolism is more important than the words in many ways. We can talk about the words in a moment, but I just find that interesting, that ancient and contemporary mapping at a symbolic level.
Well, hey there, Faithful Politics listeners and viewers. If you're joining us on YouTube, guys, thanks so much for being here for another great episode of Faithful Politics Podcast. My name is Pastor Josh Bertram. I am your faithful host here on Faithful Politics. And of course, I have our political host, Will. It's good to see you, Will.
Well, you got good taste in co-host, clearly.
That's a good one. And we are so excited, guys, to be able to bring you great content. So I'm going to say it now, and I'm going to say it at the end of the episode if I remember. Like, subscribe, do the things that help get the word out to people, because we need podcasts like this that are not screaming at people, that are not throwing muck, but are trying to understand issues deeply. So please, make sure that you do your part, and we'll keep doing ours. And today we are excited to have on the show for the first time Faithful Politics, but we've had him on the Faith Roundtable, is Dr. Mark Glanville. He works as the director for the Center of Missional Leadership at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, Canada. He's an Old Testament scholar, and he's written 5 books, including Improvising Church, Scripture as the Source of Harmony, Rhythm, and Soul, and Preaching in a New Key, Crafting Expository Sermons in a Post-Christian Communities, which that's what I talked to him about on Faith Roundtable. His vocational goals is to research, teach, write, speak, and play music to nourish Christian leaders to creatively reimagine what the church can be and do in a post-Christian society with the Bible in our hands. Mark is also a professional jazz pianist, and you will hear that as we go through our time together. And he's active in the Vancouver jazz scene. He has a podcast called Blue Note Theology, the only podcast in the world hosted from a grand piano. And his website is www.markglanville.org. We'll give you more information at the end of how you can get connected with him. Mark, so great to have you on again to talk about some articles you've written on some political issues this time, some places where the Bible and politics intersect. Thanks for being here.
So good to be with you, Josh, and well, thanks so much for having an Aussie Canadian on your show to talk about United States politics. So I'm here to learn, and it's going to be really fun.
Well, we are super looking forward to this. So I'm just going to jump right into it. Mark, you wrote a couple pieces that we're going to talk about. One is on the 10 Commandments, and it's called 10 Commandments, Zero Context. And then the second one is on immigration and the role of the church in immigration and what we're supposed to do as a sanctuary for immigrants. So I'd love to jump into what is inspiring you to write these articles that right now in our context, I mean, they're pretty controversial. Maybe they shouldn't be, maybe they should be, but they are, whatever way we go. So why did you feel compelled to write these articles?
Yeah, man. I'm Australian born and live in Canada, Vancouver, so kind of 40 minutes from the border with the United States. And one of the things that happens in the two countries that I straddle is the church does kind of have its eye on the United States, I think, not always in a healthy way. Sometimes I think that the Australian and Canadian church should differentiate itself a little better. But it means that the church leaders are watching, and very often what becomes popular in the United States becomes almost mirrored. You could even say puppeted sometimes in Canada and Australia. So for that reason, as someone living in Canada, I'm a dual citizen of Canada and Australia. It's just really important to engage. And also I have so many friends in the United States, of course, and we are one continent. I think that something that's really interesting from a Canadian Australian perspective is the way that the Bible is used a lot in United States politics in a way that it's just not in Canada and Australia. It used to be 50 years ago, but not anymore. And then that can become normative. These ways of reading scripture that perhaps a politician or a shock jock kind of podcaster might kind of use, that can become normative in the way that we assume that God thinks and the Bible teaches. So sometimes I think it's really important to engage, especially harmful interpretations of scripture or interpretations that kind of erode the compassion that's there in the biblical story. So that as churches, we can be reading the Bible together in a way that really nourishes the church in Christ's way. So thanks for your patience, having a Canadian kind of, comment on your own backyard.
Hey, we love Canadians and Australians here.
Yeah.
All right.
We do. Whereabouts in Australia are you from?
Sydney, Australia. Yeah, I grew up in a national park, kind of an hour and a half west of Sydney, which is coastal. And 2011, we moved to Vancouver. My wife's Canadian, and so it's a lot colder here. Less swimming, but beautiful in its own way,
Yeah,
swapping the beach for rainforest.
I love Australia and Canada. I went on a 2-week backpacking trip in Australia when I was in college. Landed in Brisbane. And then basically we took trains, planes, automobiles up and down the coast, Surfers Paradise, like all the places. Got to see dolphins like riding in the waves there at Surfers Paradise. It was like the coolest thing. And then Canada, of course, like it's just Canada. Like who doesn't like, poutine?
Right. Right. Fat and salt. Yeah, I mean, you're right. The east coast of Australia is incredible. Hey, just incredible surfing, incredible beaches.
Yeah, it really is. But one thing that I never associated much with my time in Canada or Australia is like any sort of religious, like, I don't know. There isn't like much religiosity in the atmosphere as there seems to be in America. So like, can you kind of walk us through like what is it that made you want to study this stuff? Because it feels like there's no like little pockets of things that would drive somebody to study the Bible.
Yeah, I mean, I would say Canada, I'll speak for Canada for now, for Vancouver, it's definitely spiritual. Like the majority of people would call themselves spiritual people. But in terms of the cultural shift, you'd have to say it's thoroughly post-Christian, which is interesting just to pause and to describe that in itself, because I think it's a little different from the United States in its texture, even though the general trajectory is probably the same. So it's in my lifetime, I'm 51 now, and it's in my lifetime that culture in Australia and Canada has moved from being essentially Christian culture. And by Christian culture, I mean where the values and symbols of the church mirror in both directions with the values and symbols of society. Definitely that was the case back in the 70s in Australia, where Christianity wasn't the news. And other religions definitely played second fiddle. But nowadays in Vancouver and Sydney, it's quite different. So that Christianity now takes its place as just one religion alongside the others. The only reason Christianity would be mentioned more might be, say, because of the residential school story, where Christian churches were kind of hand in hand with the government in terms of putting First Nations children in residential schools, the colonial story. But apart from that, the church just takes its place in the plethora of religions. And yet, in what's been called, people kind of, people bundle together from different religious traditions very often. Faith unbundles, some sociologists have called it. Faith unbundled means we unbundle the faith of our youth and then we bundle up from a potpourri of religious traditions, and that's our spirituality. It's kind of very individual, very authentic, say, in inverted commas, and that would characterize spirituality for a lot of Vancouverites. Then I look across the border in the United States, and obviously that trajectory towards post-Christian culture is definitely there. However, there's also that strong reaction against that move, which is doubling down and saying, no, we're going to be Christian, which could do some damage, I think, because the Christian faith in the biblical story, it actually flourishes in weakness. that tenderness of Jesus that we see in a Messiah crucified. And when it does kind of come with power, no, we're going to be Christian, has that risk of distorting the biblical story profoundly. So it's interesting, I think that even in those small kind of like cities that are more, have kind of been move further on this kind of turn toward post-Christian culture in the United States, say New York or San Francisco or Seattle, it's still different to Vancouver in the sense that Christianity is still part of the news story. I even noticed in the New York Times, which I read daily, Christianity comes up in a way that it wouldn't in the Globe and Mail in Canada. And that's just interesting to me. I would say that a city like New York is in the twilight of Christian culture, but it's not quite post-Christian. You know what I mean? It's really interesting, because it's, anyway, something like that.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I spent some time in New York, and there are a ton of churches in New York, and a ton of just people being very religious in general, right, in these pockets. And even for me, like growing up and in our area here, I mean, obviously we're in Richmond, Virginia. It's in the South in America. There's a lot of Christianity, Christian influence, Christian culture that's still very visible here, like say compared to New York or compared to Massachusetts, which I read recently has the lowest, I think, amount of people that would consider themselves evangelical in the, or one of them in the whole United States. But, you mentioned this backlash, and of course, this is what's happening.
Yeah.
And even like one of your articles addressing this issue in some states where now the 10 Commandments is being required to be posted in schools, even curriculum. We had someone come on from Oklahoma that her name is slipping me right now. Come on, Will, Shannon Fleck.
Right.
Shannon Fleck, who has an organization there in advocacy and has stood in the Oklahoma governmental buildings and Congress and has spoken against these kinds of curriculum and this push. And yet it's a pretty strong force to get biblical curriculum and the 10 Commandments. And you wrote about it. And I would love for you to kind of just in general, like in your article, you come from, hey, we need to understand this in context. That's what I love about the article. We got to understand this in context to really understand what's going on here and why these 10 Commandments don't help us really understand them. Why it isn't really helpful to necessarily have them in there, taken and just extracted from their original context. Why is that the case? Kind of give an overview, and we'll dig deeper into that. But what are some of the core issues there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it fascinated me from Canada to see the Texas Senate pass this bill and pass this law, as Louisiana already had done a few months previous to require the 10 Commandments to be displayed in public schools. I think that I'm an Old Testament scholar and I've studied the 10 Commandments and written on them. And it's just to understand what the 10 Commandments are doing in their ancient context is they were a program for shaping this community under the reign of Yahweh to be a community of tenderness, to be a community of justice in contradistinction to Egypt, the oppression of Egypt that they just left. So when you come to Exodus chapter 20, which is where the 10 Commandments first appears, and it's repeated on the kind of the edge of the Jordan in Deuteronomy 5, the Decalogue's given a second time. When it's given at Sinai, the 10 Commandments are given 2.5 months, only 2.5 months after Yahweh emancipated God's ancient people from enslavement in Egypt. So these people, as they receive these 10 laws, are really a nation essentially of slaves. They've been emancipated, but their imagination hasn't moved beyond their identity as an enslaved people. And these laws given at Sinai are shaping God's people to be a people where there can be no pharaohs, where there can be no pharaohs that are accumulating resources and wealth on the backs of other people's labor at the expense of others. So, I mean, in this article, I just take the readers back to what was happening there. And the ancient Hebrews were building the brick factories They're working in the brick factories of Pharaoh, building these storage cities of Pithom and Ramesses. Exodus chapter 5, we learn that Hebrew foremen were beaten, sometimes doubtless to death, if brick quotas weren't met. So this was a slave economy. And then there's this great act of emancipation. There's the burning bush in Exodus 3 and 4. You remember that. This wonderful act of slave emancipation. I mean, we could mention as an aside the bravery of many Hebrews, like those Hebrew midwives, remember? Those people who kind of, or Miriam, Moses' sister, in those early chapters, these resistors, incredible stories, especially of women. And then the burning bush. And then Yahweh comes down and emancipates God's people. And here at Sinai, God's given these instructions, these 10 words, but as well, a whole biblical corpora, a corpora of law, this body of law in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy that's shaping God's people to be this community of tenderness. And so when we understand the narrative context, all of a sudden we can start to exegete these laws aright. And when we understand the Ten Commandments in the context of the law corpuses in specifically Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and Exodus, you see that this is a program for tenderness, for social justice, and for bringing the weakest among us into the center of the community, because that's what happens when Yahweh is king and not Pharaoh. Man, there is so much I could say that I'm sitting at the piano. Can I make this musical for a second, Josh and Will?
I'm really offended you haven't so far, so please do.
Yeah. Thanks, Will. I think, so I'm a professional jazz pianist and as well as a biblical scholar, and I did much of my scholarship on biblical law. And this occurred to me pretty late in time. I was journeying in both for some years before I realized this fascinating thing, that biblical law, that I'll unpack for you in a minute, and jazz and blues both have their roots in slavery. Isn't that crazy? And both, like the evil and atrocity and abhorrence of slavery, and somehow jazz and blues and biblical law, including the Ten Commandments, sing the song of the human soul and invite us to something more hopeful and more beautiful. I think that's incredible. And I was journeying with both as a professional in both areas without realizing the connection. It was honestly reading James Cone, Crossing the Lynching Tree, when it suddenly came together for me, all that music in that book. So just to kind of illustrate, if I may, Will, do you mind if I talk about jazz and blues for a tick?
Please do. Yeah.
It's obviously, it's your story more than mine, so just shut me up and correct me when I get this wrong. But I think it's interesting for the musicians on the call just to think about it in terms of music. Like, I'm kind of sitting at the piano here. And as a musician, I can tell you there's the three what we call blue notes characterize the blues music. So I'll think in the key of C, for example, here, for the sake of just illustrating this, and the three blue notes in the key of C are what we call the flattened third, which in the key of C is E flat. So here's C and here's E. We flatten that E to a flattened third, and that's the first blue note in the blues in the key of C. So I'll just show you. So you can hear that kind of blue note. The second blue note is the flattened seventh. So we're in C again. So here is C to B. That's a major seven in classical music, and we flatten that to a B flat, which is a flattened seven. Instead of a major seven, a flattened seven. And you'll recognize it. You get that blues sound. And then think of the third blues note is a flattened fifth. So C to G. And this is the one that holds the most tension. And you recognize this from the kind of old rock and roll players, like Little Richard. But what's really interesting is you see these three beautiful blues notes is that tension, that suffering, that genius of the Black American community, that musical genius, that creative spirit, it's all there in those three notes. You can hear suffering, your sadness, maybe outrage, indignation. You can hear genius, that's for sure. And within the blues, there's always incredible hope. After all, we're together, we're alive, we're playing together, we're creating together. That resurrection shout, there's always the moan of the cross and the resurrection shout. And we know that blues is absolutely the foundation of really of all Western contemporary music. Like from hip hop to Britney Spears, the blues is the foundation. Like that's genius, right? And it's that black story and that black creative spirit. But then you come to biblical law, and there's that story of enslavement now in Egypt, and then we come to Sinai, and by the inspiration of the Spirit, the creativity of God, when it comes to the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, the genius of those Old Testament scribes who knew suffering themselves. And biblical law is this, a bit like the blues, this invitation to be that hopeful community, to be that community that brings the weakest among us to the center, which is exactly what the blues does. So I think of that parallel is just fascinating. The beauty in the biblical story, and biblical law is the foundation of the biblical story that we see ultimately expressed in the life of Jesus, his tenderness up close and personal with people. So I can get into the details of biblical law and talk more about the 10 Commandments and then actually talk about what does it look like to have these in the classroom and what does that signify. I'd love to do that, but I've said a lot, so I'll just pause.
No, I really appreciate you sharing that. And there was something that you said that did kind of stick out to me because, like, I do think that the Bible, Christianity, can be a very beautiful religion. And I think it's because of man, we've sort of perverted it and kind of wielded it as a item of power because it is powerful. I mean, I was talking to somebody the other day about that Denzel Washington movie, The Book of Eli, like spoiler alert, like he has a Bible, like, and he's traveling across country protecting like this last remaining Bible because it's so powerful. And having you say that, the biblical law was rooted kind of in slavery. It's just, it goes to show how humans can always be counted on to screw things up because we've used that same biblical law to help perpetuate slavery, to help perpetuate Jim Crow laws, to really make people think of the Bible as something that it's not. Like humans, like we've done this, and I'm glad that at least there's still like some remnants of folks out there that can still, look at the Bible, not get super like angry at it, but just admire it for the beautiful work that it is, and just recognizing that it's humans that have messed it up. It's not the Bible that's imperfect. It's us. Like we're the ones that are screwing things up. So I just wanted to kind of just say that because I don't know, your music made me think about it. So, but I do want to talk about your article for sure, and I definitely want to talk about 10 Commandments because that's your area of expertise. But I want to offer at least one thing, kind of in response to Josh's question. Josh had asked, like, what's the deal with all these 10 Commandments stuff coming in our classroom? And I don't know how familiar you are with like Project Blitz. So Project Blitz is this like thing in America that took place several years ago. I think it's like 2016, 2019. I'm probably getting my numbers mixed up somewhere, but it was a concerted effort to actually use states as sort of little mini science experiments to interject more Christianity in society. And one of the tactics is, maybe it's like getting In God We Trust on license plates. Maybe it's getting prayer in public school. Maybe it's getting 10 Commandments. So I love to kind of just get your thoughts about, the 10 Commandments in particular, like what's so special about the 10 Commandments, and how did the 10 Commandments become sort of this like this like image of all things Christianity?
Yeah, 100%. It's I mean, I think in the Old Testament they're not nearly as important as they are in modern culture. I think that they're repeated. You could say that they, in many ways, they encapsulate much of biblical law that I'll talk about in a minute. But at the same time, they just take their place in among the law codes of the Old Testament. I think in the Christian tradition, they've had more and more importance. In the Reformation, they were very, very important to the Reformers. Calvin saw them as a summary of God's moral law, of course. They're there in the Presbyterian kind of Westminster Catechism. They were summarized. You had to know them by heart. And so I think that now, when we come to our day and age, they're not just, they actually become symbolic. They have a symbolic power. It's a bit like installing a symbol to say we own this place, which is fascinating, I think, when it comes to putting like the Ten Commandments almost as a plaque on a classroom wall. This is just an interesting piece of history, but the Ten Commandments on stone tablets is related to the ancient practice of a covenant between the great kings. And what would happen is the very powerful kings of Mesopotamia, the Neo-Babylonian kings, the Neo-Assyrian kings, the Neo-Persian kings in the 1st century BCE, they'd subjugate another king, like ancient Israel were subjugated. And they would oppress them under what's called a covenant or a treaty. And these treaties were literally written on stone, like the Ten Commandments, and installed in the temple of the subjugated king, like the Ten Commandments. Do you remember the Ten Commandments are put there in the Ark of the Covenant, put there in the Holy of Holies? Well, we know that's exactly what they did with these covenant tablets. And what that, like for example, the Vassal Treaty of Esarhaddon, which is a text that we have, one of these ancient treaties that would probably installed in Israel, the northern kingdom, in 1st century BCE. And that was Esarhaddon saying, I own this place. And there seems to me to almost be a mapping on what's happening right now with the Ten Commandments installed, in inverted commas, in school classrooms. It's really Christians saying, we own this place. It's just, the symbolism is more important than the words in many ways. We can talk about the words in a moment, but I just find that interesting, that ancient and contemporary mapping at a symbolic level.
Yeah, I do want to talk about the words, but this is just more of a curiosity, if anything, because like if you were to ask me to describe what I think the Ten Commandments look like or the Ark of the Covenant, like my mind's going to go either to Indiana Jones or like some old Charleston Heston like movie. So like can like are the Ten Commandments like literally like, with a chisel, talk me through like the actual reality of the Ten Commandments, the objective, I can touch it, or at one point in time I could have touched it, or something like that.
Yeah, right. That's right. So, I mean, it would have been etched on clay and then hardened. And then, I mean, in ancient times, these covenants were often, if it was a great Neo-Assyrian king, it might have been copied 20 times for 20 different kingdoms to declare the royal kingship of Esarhaddon, the Neo-Assyrian king, over his empire. And every kingdom gets a copy of this clay covenant. And so in ancient Israel, it's not this oppressive king, Esarhaddon. It's actually an emancipating God who judges Pharaoh as an oppressive king and creates a clay stone tablet and, hardens it and gives it to Moses as a law that's shaping the community to be completely different. And I think that is fascinating to me, that the Hebrew scribes, by the inspiration of the Spirit, that this highly militarized, barbaric, traumatizing metaphor of a covenant, which was real in ancient times, this militarized metaphor is completely turned upside down and appropriated to reveal something about a God of grace, about a God of tenderness, about a slave emancipating God. Incredible to me. So, I mean, just to get into that content for a second, like just take one command, say, thou shalt not steal. Let's take that. The eighth commandment. So when I was a young adult, I would think of thou shalt not steal. The image that came to mind was Hamburglar from McDonald's. That was big in Australia.
Nice.
Was that a thing in the United States? He had a black mask.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. We are all familiar with the Hamburglar.
Yeah. So I think if I'm honest, the image I was getting was a very poor person breaking into a rich person's mansion and kind of, I'll play it on the piano, kind of creeping around at night. And maybe he finds a golden ring. But
nice.
So a poorer person in a mask breaking into a rich person's house. But actually, you can see already from the narrative frame of the Ten Commandments that the opposite is true. Thou shalt not steal is restraining would-be pharaohs, those who would accumulate at the expense of others among God's people. It's saying to those with means and power, and I'll substantiate this in a moment, you can't live like that. You can't be a Pharaoh, because that's not the way we're going to live when I'm king, Yahweh is saying. And so if you then look at there's so many places we could go. Check me out by reading Isaiah 58. Check me out by reading Deuteronomy 24 and see these related laws and the way that the emphasis of the law, the emphasis of the Torah is to restrain those with power and means. People can't judicial law. You can't use your power and means to turn the courts against the poor. You can't use your power and means to in debt and enslave those who have less than you. Thou shalt not steal. One way that's kind of incarnated or embodied among ancient Israel is to do with land law. If you know anything about the way that land worked in ancient Israel, it was that land was what we say inalienable. Every household was attached to some land upon which they could subsist, and the land could never permanently be separated from that household. Just think about that. Every single household has land upon which they can subsist, and it was hard to survive in ancient Israel. Syria-Palestine is a hard place to live and survive if you're a farmer. And so the land inalienable, it's permanently attached. Thou shalt not steal is saying you can't take someone's land permanently, because the land belongs to every household. You can't become a pharaoh and accumulate all the land and all the wealth. And we know in a farming economy, land is everything. But this wealth-producing capital is in the hands of every household. A way to summarize the spirit of the Torah, the spirit of the law of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, is like this. God owns it all, and God wants everyone to be able to enjoy some of it. Therefore thou shalt not steal.
I absolutely love that imagery, and it leads to a question that I have that's going to continue us on this trajectory. But this idea that in our Western culture, these 10 commandments are viewed symbolically, very much so, and I love that symbolism. And just as a quick aside, one tablet was the idea of 2 was that one would have. It would be 2 copies of it, right? The same one, and one would be stored and the other one would be stored. Is that the idea of those 2, or do we not know?
We don't really know. Scholars generally think it was probably, 1 to 5 and then 6 to 10. But others have argued kind of duplicate. But
just kind of anyway. Yeah, that makes sense. Sorry. So anyway, but the idea that it's very individualistic, like you're saying, like, do not steal means, hey, I shouldn't steal something from my friend, which of course that is a good application of that. I shouldn't take something that's someone else's. And yet there's more to it. And especially we miss this communal aspect of the 10 Commandments. I would love for you to help us think through, thinking through aloud, how interpreting the 10 Commandments as a communal rather than individualistic through a communal lens instead of individualistic changes the way that we view it and how we engage.
Thanks, Josh. Great question. That gets to the heart of it. So you're right. I think the way that I grew up understanding the 10 Commandments is in that individual kind of individual morality. So don't steal. I think, okay, I won't steal. Maybe I stole a cookie or 2 when I was a kid, but now I'm an adult. I'm not going to do that. And don't commit adultery. Well, I haven't yet. Touch what I won't. And, or don't use the Lord's name in vain. I used to just think that was, saying 4-letter words. And the point is that when you interpret it through that individualistic lens, it's really restraining the kind of excesses of individual behavior. It's saying, don't do these things that are off limits. It's in a sense kind of constructing a good citizen at that individualistic level. Now, on a surface level, that's not such a bad thing, sure. But there's not a deep personal challenge either. Like, it's just restraining the outer limits of behavior. Don't murder. Well, I haven't murdered and I probably won't. You know what I mean? But it's actually much deeper than that, and it's a narrative frame that hints at it, but also just the fact that the Torah at Sinai is shaping a community. It's shaping a community of God's people in, frankly, a collectivist context. So let's play it on the piano. You could, if we interpreted the Old Testament, the Ten Commandments individualistically, it would still be nice, and we could think of a lovely melody to play. So there's a beauty there. We don't have people going around murdering. Great. But, there's a beauty there, and it's a value. But actually, the narrative frame shows that it's saying, don't go back to Egypt. We're going to be a different kind of society. We're going to be a society where every person can flourish, especially the most vulnerable. We're going to be a society where none of you can be pharaohs. And you go to something like Deuteronomy 17, the law of the king, and the Israelite king isn't even permitted to look like a king. It's not really a king. You can't have wives, you can't accumulate resources, you can't have a big army. And then it says in this shocking kind of phrase, don't take the people back to Egypt. Even the king can't be really recognizable as an ancient king. In Deuteronomy 17, the law of the king. So now, when you put it in this communal frame, we start to see that it's shaping a society of mutual care. It's shaping a society that brings the weakest into the center, because that's what happens when Yahweh is king. So all of a sudden, thou shalt not murder, for example, let's go there. It takes a completely different shape. In Egypt, financial accumulation, financial profit was prized above human life. And actually, when you think about it, that's exactly what happens in so many societies. I mean, in Western society, my mind goes to 200 years ago in England, where if someone stole a sheep, in order to feed their family, they'd be put to death. That's just interesting in itself. That's an example. Sure, we don't want people stealing sheep, but it's an example of economic productivity being priced higher than human life. Or you think of the slaveocracy in the United States, which it wasn't so long ago. Or you think, goodness me, of international trade laws. You think of the movement of money and indebtedness of majority world countries. That, again, is prioritizing financial profit over human life. And the reality is that the thou shalt not murder, put in that communal frame, actually is an invitation to us to live more beautifully. So now we can come back to there was our individual melody. And it's so much more beautiful when we're a community, because communities up close and personal can live beautifully.
I love that. That is so cool. Just, can you tell me, how are you connecting the music to the things that you're saying? Because I'm watching you and I'm listening to you and I'm hearing the music you're playing, and it sounds really great. It sounds almost too perfect. So I'm curious, what's going through your mind at any given moment to make you want to hit the certain keys that you want to hit for the points that you're trying to make?
Yeah, I mean, it's a growth edge for me in my own life. Well, I think I was trained as an academic, and it's easy for me to kind of privilege an academic, rational way of knowing as the way of knowing. But I think I'm 51 now, as I said, and I think more the years go by, I think actually the intuition and the arts is a way of knowing too. I think artists are like Christians in that we're people who seek the truth. Jesus says, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life." I think an artistic practice done deeply is a seeking after truth with an artistic intuition, whether it's painting or sculpture or dance. I really think we're reaching for truth, leaning into truth. So, direct answer to your question, I just try and sit back and I think, okay, Mark, just stop being so rational for a moment. And what do you know as an artist?
It's so cool to kind of hear and see what's going inside of the mind. Like it's actually interesting because in my work with AI, like I do a lot of work with AI and these large language models. And one of the amazing things that you can do is have it think out loud. Right. And just this idea, and I've actually been doing that practice in my own life where I'm like, someone asks me a question, and instead of just trying to think about the answer without saying anything, it's much more natural to think out loud and just start talking, and then to say, well, if I'm going to really answer that question, then I got to think about this. And then it's like the way it segments it, and it makes it so that you can logically very easily connect one thing to the next, and really helps you to work through it. And I just, I love when hearing people think, like even having people on the podcast, I'm actually much more interested, not in their opinions, although I want to hear what the conclusions. I shouldn't say opinions. I should say conclusions. I'm very interested in their conclusions, but I'm just as interested or even more in how they came to those conclusions. And I would love to think about for a moment, kind of shift over. It's gonna be overlap. It's still gonna connect to the Ten Commandments, I'm sure. But thinking about your article on immigration, you wrote a recent article on immigration, and at the and I'm just gonna say the conclusion that I kind of came to, and then I'm going to ask you to kind of defend that through some questions, and tell me if this is an incorrect interpretation of what you're trying to get at. Basically, in this article, what you're trying to do is you're trying to say Christian communities, so the argument you make, conclusion, Christian communities are biblically mandated to offer sanctuary to undocumented immigrants, embracing them as kin, even when such actions conflict with governmental directives. Now, I don't know, would you say that that's a fair interpretation of the conclusion in your article?
Thanks for reading it closely. I would say that's probably slightly sharper or edgier than I would have put it, but you've read it closely. I think that there is a biblical mandate to welcome and enfold the person who doesn't have a home and is seeking a home. We could talk about that. I think Jesus broke the law. The Apostle Paul sometimes broke the law. The Hebrew midwives in Exodus broke the law. And
the apostle said, right, we have to obey God rather than man.
Right. And to be sure, that it is so important, and this is what Romans 13 is saying, that we live peaceably, that we obey the government authorities. But that comes in the context of the biblical story. It's wisdom. It's, it's chachma, the skill of living well in God's world. The Bible's about wisdom, and that means making complex judgments sometimes. And that's what we're being called to do at this time in the United States, to make complex judgments. So I want to go and answer that question directly, but I actually want to ask you guys a question, if I may.
Please.
And I mean this genuinely. This isn't a rhetorical question. So I wrote that article maybe 6 weeks ago, and I was saying, with the behavior of ICE right now, with changing legislation, sanctuary is less and less possible. Churches are no longer safe spaces, so churches are going to have to get creative about it, but we still have to defend those who are seeking a home and are vulnerable. And now, of course, what's happened the last week is that white people in South Africa, often with Dutch heritage, have been designated refugees by the Trump administration. The refugee program, which is actually the largest refugee intake program in the world, is very, very important. Canada plays its role, Australia plays its role, but the United States, because of its wealth and population, plays a bigger role. The refugee program has been frozen, including people like Afghans who've been working for the United States government, no longer have access. People are being deported, and white people from South Africa are getting refugee status. The level of persecution they're facing is nothing compared to those whose refugee status is no longer possible. So I'll just say it blankly. It really sounds like white supremacy to me from across the border. It looks like racism and white privilege. So I just actually, I think my gut feeling as a Canadian as I watch this is that immigration and refugee welcome actually, when you dig deep, has more to do with race and racism and white supremacy at that deep gut motivation level. I'm an outsider, so I'm just I'm not pulling punches here. I'm just saying how it looks. Could I just ask you guys, is that how you're feeling
Please.
it out?
Go ahead, Will. You respond first, unless you want me to.
Yeah, I think there's probably some truth to that.
Right.
I'll be honest. I'm not following the South African story as much as I am just our own southern border immigration woes, and I know that there have been a lot of really good folks doing great work for that are Christian. We spoke to a gentleman. I think he wrote a book called Migrant God. Isaac Villegas, I think was his name. But his whole book was about essentially just helping people across the desert trying to get here, and he shared these really like personal testimonies of this pregnant woman, that had already walked hundreds of miles, and they were trying to give her clothes and food, and all the people as part of his organization like threw her like a makeshift baby shower. It was just like super like heartwarming and touching. So I do think that, number one, there are Christians out there doing the good work. Do I think that this administration's motivated by racist ideas? Yeah. I mean, because like if you just look at the people that he surrounds himself with, Stephen Miller's probably one of them. He surrounds himself with folks that are self-professed Christians that also are white evangelicals. And as Josh and I were actually talking before we started recording, I was like, I wrote a Substack about how white evangelicals definitely feel like they are more persecuted than other marginalized groups, and that data is borne out in a lot of different places, Barna and PRI and other places. Right. So I'm not just making this up.
The data that they feel that way, right? Well, not that it's actually occurring.
Yeah. The data that they feel this way is everywhere and not hard to find. So I think if you think about that, about what the data says this particular group thinks about their own persecution, and then you layer in the refugees we're bringing in from South Africa, I don't think you have to look really hard on how you draw those dots. But I think if you only just knew the South African part and you knew the refugee part, an outside observer would be like, yeah, we should welcome everybody. Doesn't matter what they look like or what country they come from. But, kind of seeing the bigger picture and the context, I think you could probably, make a strong argument for what's motivating these things. So go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, coming from a perspective, right? So I got to say something it's just been on my heart, and I appreciate the question, Mark. So I have a call on Monday nights, and Will often will jump on that call with me. He goes to the church, and so we're brothers in Christ, and we're good friends, and we have some other guys that come on, and for whatever reason, just by happenstance or whatever, I'm the only white guy on the call on Monday nights normally, which I actually really love. I don't even think about it anymore, but like in this perspective, last week I did think about it, and here's why I realized I did think about it. It was either last week or the week before, but I essentially we were talking about patriotism. And I was talking about like how, I felt like I'm all for Christians being patriots. And I talked about how I grew up like I felt like this was my country. I felt like I would die for my country. And I'm not saying this as any kind of like in a negative light on any of my brothers that were on the call. But they disagreed. And Will is someone who's been in the armed forces, and Will, you can respond and give I'm not trying to speak for you, but he served our military. He's served, he's been injured for our country. He's had to go through issues, all sorts of stuff. I'm not going to name his issues, right? HIPAA violation. Hello. So, but he has gone through his own thing for our country, served in the infantry. And thank you for your service, Will. I know I've told you that before, but truly, and to hear this perspective from my black brothers that yeah, I just didn't feel like the same way. I didn't necessarily feel like this was my country, or I didn't feel like this was like I was like that patriotism was not a huge important thing. And then thinking about it and like, yeah, I mean, if I belonged to a group of people that had been systematically identified, targeted, oppressed, enslaved, and persecuted for hundreds of years within the West. And then as, you know, in my dad's lifetime, right, my dad was in segregated schools. He remembers when they bust people in. He grew up in Washington, D.C. He remembers the integration of schools.
Wow.
And this is my dad.
Yeah.
And so one generation from segregation.
Yeah.
And I think, man, now my son is 11 and we are in a country where it's tough, man. It does feel like, so I don't know the truth of all of it. I'm not gonna claim to have some God's eye view of this, but all I know is my friends of color, many of them are afraid. Not all. I mean, well, all of my friends are, but I'm not saying all people of color are afraid. But many, and feel like I've heard comments from people I know that are critical thinkers, people of color, that are like, I'm afraid that they're trying to take us back to the 1800s in America. And it's hard for me to wrap my mind around that. But then I see things like this, like you're saying the Afrikaners, right, being the only, I think, I don't want to misspeak, but they're the only people that Trump has given refugee status to so far.
That's right.
And so you, the only people that Trump has given refugee status to are a group of people from a country well known for its racism in recent years. And they're being given status because they're being racially persecuted. I don't know how you interpret it. It certainly doesn't look, it's not moving in the equality direction. It doesn't seem like, in terms of like, to me at least. And so, it's a long answer to your question, Mark, but it's very concerning. All of this is very concerning. And I don't hear a lot of straight answers on it. I don't hear a lot of honest answers on it. I hear a lot of anger and people getting really mad about this woke this and this woke that. And I don't consider myself woke. I never have. But I'm just like, why are we demonizing this to such an extent and have so little compassion sometimes? It boggles my mind. And then to imagine, like, are my friends, my people that I love dearly, my Black friends, they're actually afraid? Like, this should bother me to such a degree. Like, I should not be okay with that. And that's kind of where I am right now. Like, it was just this stark reminder, like, this was my country because that's what I was told. And I was never persecuted. I was never oppressed. I was never part of a group that was systematically kept down. And it just was very enlightening. And I'm very concerned. I'm very concerned. And of course, that's going to make me the woke pastor and the one that, the shepherd for sale and all this stuff, and honestly, I don't care, man. I'm a conservative. I was telling my wife this the other day. If conservative means not biblical, then I'm not conservative. If conservative means I don't have compassion on people, on immigrants, I don't have compassion on people that are marginalized, then I'm not a conservative, and I don't want to be. But that's not what conservatism is to me.
Yeah. How would you describe what conservatism is to you, Josh?
Oh, I mean, I think I would describe it as, hey, I'm trying to, well, if I think about it in an ideological way, I'm saying there are certain things from the past that we shouldn't be too quick to get rid of. Radical change very quickly tends to lead to a lot of conflict and tension, and there might not be enough time to think it through and to really understand what things are worth conserving. Why did that thing within our culture, so think about marriage and the definition of marriage. I have a traditional definition of marriage. That's what I believe in, because I think that's what the Bible teaches. And also there's a cultural amount to that. So, and before changing that, let's think through. But like, for instance, like Loving v. Virginia, Will wrote something on that the other day. It was the Supreme Court decision that allowed people of different races to get married. And I'm sitting there looking and I'm like, yeah, of course. Why would we not want that? And yet that would have been considered a very liberal and radical view. In my dad's generation. And if my roots are in the South, Alabama and Kansas, and there has been a racism, an implicit racism. And I know even some people from my family can get uncomfortable when I say this, but I think it's been there in my family. I think it's been there certainly in my extended family and in our roots. There's no doubt in my mind. Just from things I've heard and known and experienced and everything. So it's there, and this is very concerning that we would be taking these kinds of steps back. And I know that's an oversimplified what would it be? An oversimplified assessment of the situation, but that's kind of where I am right now. It's kind of where I am right now.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks so much. Thanks for just describing what conservatism means for you, and the way that you just unapologetically with the Bible in your hand. It's a call to justice and equality. Thank you so much, and it just reminds us that it's not black and white, right and left. We can follow Jesus' tenderness and not have to radicalize. We can find a third way.
Well, absolutely. I mean, conservatism, and again, but it's changed. It's changed. And think about what conservative was in 300 years ago. Conservative was king. Conservative was divine right of king. Conservative was right. I mean, that's like what is the guy John Locke, or maybe it's not like, but the guy wrote Leviathan. Right. So it's like. That was conservative. So am I that conservative? No. Americans don't want a king. We don't want anything to do with that.
Well put.
So yeah, if conservative changes to a place where we throw out the Bible, essentially the clear teachings of Jesus, then I think it's imperative on every Christian to no longer be conservative. That's my thinking on it. I don't know. What do you think, Mark? And then I'd love to just have one more question for you.
Yeah. I mean, if I may, I'm not the host here. I'd love to hear Will's response to your excellent comments, Josh.
Oh, I mean, like, so many thoughts, so many comments, so many Josh. I think what Josh just talked about, I mean, one I already kind of knew just because him and I talk outside of the podcast. But I do think it brings to light, the importance of having these kinds of conversations. Because like Josh and I often will opine about where our minds would be at if we didn't have this podcast. Because
helpful. We
started this podcast. I mean, to be honest, not with a lot of thoughts that we're going to become famous, and we don't want to become famous. Actually, Josh and I have 2 full-time jobs that we really enjoy doing. And this podcast came about as a bit of a passion hobby project, but then just kind of ballooned. But then we still try to stay humble, talk to people about kind of where they're at, and the people we talk to don't all have a bunch of letters behind their name. Sometimes it's just, hey, I had a really bad church experience, and then we bring them on, and then thousands of people are like, thank you. That's me, So I appreciate, Josh giving us a piece of his heart about where he stood on patriotism. Because I think that he's not alone. I think there's probably a lot more people that are kind of at this sort of crossroads where they're just like, I don't really know where my faith fits into the broader picture. Like, I love Jesus. I love my friends that also love Jesus, but I don't like seeing Jesus on Fox News every night. Like, I like seeing Jesus at the homeless shelter. I like seeing Jesus, helping the refugee, the immigrant. I don't need Jesus, campaigning for a third term or whatever the case may be. Like, I just need them. I need the personal Jesus in my life to be present and real for me and for other people to see that Jesus. And if they choose to, want a piece of that, I'm happy to tell them about it. But at the rate we're going now, especially in America, it's just like folks are leaving churches, folks are leaving denominations. Is this gradual blending of faith and politics in ways that we really quite haven't seen in a while. Our Supreme Court, I feel like I'm on a soapbox. Our Supreme Court is heavily loaded with folks that would love to see, the wall of separation be torn down. Which I know it's not in the Constitution, but the Establishment Clause is. So for those haters that want to say something, I just want to put that out there. So, yeah, I mean, we're just in a really weird time, and we're just so lucky and blessed to have folks like you to talk to, Mark, to help us work through
it's a blessing to talk to you guys. Can I respond?
I would love to hear your thoughts. Yeah, and then I just have one practical thought afterwards, like a question before we close. But please help us.
I think, we've gone to the Ten Commandments. We've seen the narrative frame. We've kind of looked at the way the Ten Commandments is shaping this community of tenderness. This is what people in society look like when Yahweh is king, not Pharaoh. And I just want to come to Jesus, as you've mentioned, well. I think, one way that the Old Testament is often misinterpreted, or another way that it's misinterpreted, is it can be diminished. We think, for example, of Matthew chapter 5, which is the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, which runs Matthew 5-7. Jesus says, I've not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And so for so many years, I thought that fulfill pretty much meant to abolish, like that right, that somehow Jesus' death and resurrection, we don't have to worry about the Old Testament too much. We know God created the world, but we're not sure about what the rest, it just kind of all points to Jesus in a more symbolic form. But actually what Jesus meant when he said, remember this is the beginning on the Sermon on the Mount. He's going to teach us the Lord's Prayer. He's going to teach us to love our enemies. He's going to teach us about forgiveness, and he's going to teach us about trust and not being anxious. He's going to give us the Beatitudes, blessed are the meek. When Jesus said, I've come to fulfill the law, he means the best translation and interpretation of that is I've come to bring to full expression. Fulfill meaning to bring to full expression Jesus is saying, in my life, in my ministry, and in the people I'm gathering, this renewed Israel. Matthew chapter 5 begins that his disciples sat around him. Jesus is teaching on the Mount and his disciples sitting around him. He's shaping the people of God, actually reappropriating the Torah, the law, and unfolding it in new ways in light of the coming Messiah, which is him. He's saying, I fulfill this. And isn't that exactly what we see in the Gospels? I think my mind goes right now to Luke 15:1-2, where Jesus was in trouble, and the Jewish leaders said, this man befriends sinners and eats with them. This man's sinners and prostitutes and tax collectors, all those, in inverted commas, the wrong people in society, in inverted commas, wrong people, but in the lens of the kingdom of God, exactly the right people. And when Jesus says bring to full expression, we can see that in the Ten Commandments now. We can see that tenderness, that bringing the weakest among us into the center is exactly what Jesus is doing. That's our Savior. That's our Lord. And if we're evangelicals, and, I could say I'm a Canadian evangelical, which is quite different to a United States evangelical. For me, evangelical means all about Jesus, all about the Bible. And because of Jesus and the Bible, justice and bringing the weakest among us into the center, and humility. That's what evangelical means in Canada. It's all about Jesus.
I really appreciate those words, and I hope that that's kind of where we move in America. I think we need that. We need that public discourse. We need the public engagement, and we're big on that. I mean, that's why we do this, so that we are engaging with culture and public and in politics. I think there should be Christian influence. I'm a big proponent of that. But Jesus, representing Jesus, not Pharaoh. And I just love the way that you've contextualized this for us. It makes more sense, and it's so relevant to what we're going through right now. I just really appreciate, Mark, you coming on, sharing your thoughts. How can people follow your work, and what do you have coming up next for them to look out for? Thanks so much. Yeah, love for you to kind of subscribe somehow to my Blue Note Theology podcast. If you're a preacher, check out Preaching in a New Key, Crafting Expository Sermons in Post-Christian Context. Check out my book on Exodus if you want more on the Ten Commandments, or my book, Improvising Church, A Vision for Church in Post-Christian Context. Thank you so much for your support, Josh and Will. I've got to get you on my podcast. Yes, we'll absolutely do that. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to give our classic line. And then if you would be willing, Mark, would you play a little tune to play us out? And so, guys, until next time, keep your conversations not right or left, but up, and enjoy this little tune. I love that. This is a song I wrote, jazz tune about 6 months ago called My Trolley. In Montreal, a trolley is like a thing that kids, little boys, little girls had pulled along with them. And it just kind of, a friend of mine was describing his childhood, and his trolley represented the journey of life. So this is a journey of life, and I play it as a prayer.
That was amazing. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. God bless, guys. Hey there, Josh Bertram here, faithful host of the Faithful Politics Podcast. I want to let you know about a compelling new spinoff, the Faith Roundtable, where I'll be interviewing top faith leaders, theologians, and scholars to unpack the pressing issues that are shaping the church in America today. We'll dive into topics like faith in public life, social justice, and how we can engage our communities more effectively. Make sure you don't miss any of our enlightening conversations by subscribing to it on our YouTube channel. Join me at the Faith Roundtable, where deep discussion meets thoughtful insight.